Without question, the B Specials were a partisan force. They were resented and feared by the Catholic population, who were convinced that in the 20s and 30s riots, the Special Constabulary had supported loyalist attacks and had even been guilty of sectarian murder.
Oh, God, hatred. Hatred. Hatred in our hearts. I know I have that hatred in my heart from, and for the Irish, they could never forget what they did do, you know.
They were a gang of thugs. They weren't a police force at all, you know, corner boys. It was one way of getting them into, getting them guns and letting them on the loose. Oh, there's no doubt about that.
The B Specials, they were confined practically to the one religion because they were ignored by the Roman Catholic population. And they became a sectarian force, which was not for the good of any country, you know.
A new Parliament building had been opened at Stormont in 1932. The Unionist Party had by the 60s held power for 40 years. No Catholic had held ministerial office. The civil service, which served these politicians, was almost entirely Protestant too. Of 500 important civil servants, only 36 were Catholic. The only successful piece of legislation to originate from the Catholic Nationalist Party was the Wild Birds Act of 1931. And discrimination went beyond government. As the Cameron report was to show, discrimination against Catholics was widespread throughout Northern Ireland society.
Catholics did contribute to the situation they found themselves in, quite simply because of the fact they refused to recognise the state, participate in the state, and therefore refused to take jobs in the civil service. That was one area. And then we had their attitude towards education, in which the educational system that appertained within the Catholic community was orientated more towards the arts and languages, whereas in the Protestant state schools it was orientated towards engineering and banking and commerce. Therefore the Protestant children were more able to compete for the jobs that were coming on the market.
Discrimination had become a way of life by the 1960s. 40 years of the northern state had entrenched it, so that in certain areas like local government, under some of the councils, virtually no Catholics were employed, or there were grades of posts for which no Catholics need apply. This had ludicrous examples, like in County Fermanagh, where a majority of the population was Catholic. For the job of school bus driver, which required no great skill, there were something like 75 school bus drivers, of whom only 7 were Catholics.
This film looked at housing in Fintona, County Tyrone, in 1953. Of the town's 314 houses, about a quarter were like these, old, without basic amenities, and mostly inhabited by Catholics.
Most of these little houses hold big families. Here are Mrs. Quinn and 3 of her children outside their cottage in Back Lane. There are 6 in the family, all living here. Mr. Campbell of Mill Street and some of his children. 8 people live here. There's a family of 8 here too. This is Mrs. McGuigan, Castle Street, with 5 of her children. Mrs. Pearson, Water Lane, with 5 of her children. Again a family of 8. Mrs. Mullen of Mill Street has 8 children, all living here. Big families and little houses are normal in these back streets of Fintona.
48 council houses have been built recently in Fintona, some at Craigavon Park, but only a quarter had gone to Catholics, who made up 2/3 of the population. It was common for small Protestant families from sound homes to get council houses.
For example, number 5 Craigavon Park is occupied only by Mr. Gillespie and his wife. Number 12 only by Mrs. Weir and her daughter. Mrs. Adams lives alone in number 9 and Mrs. Jones alone in number 10. Miss Mills lives alone in number 7. Mr. Gibson and his wife live alone at 24 Mitchellburn Terrace. Mr. Coulter and his wife at number 7. Mr. Holsworth and his sister at number 1. Most of these people already had quite comfortable homes when the council houses were allotted to them. Mr. Holsworth, for instance, sold this farm at Kilgort, near Fintona, before moving to his new house. This bungalow at Coney Warren, 10 miles from Fintona, is also a council house controlled by the Omagh Rural District Council. Mrs. Jones left it for 10 Craigavon Park, where she lives alone.
Such injustices could not have happened in the rest of the United Kingdom. Local authorities there allocated houses on a point system. People were placed on the waiting list according to the size of their family and the condition of their house. In Northern Ireland, it was at the discretion of local councillors.
I would be very foolish to deny that certainly discrimination did take place. But I think it must be pointed out that discrimination went on in both camps. Protestants against Catholics and Catholics against Protestants. And I think it must be accepted that politicians, to exist and continue in power, will always discriminate against the other side, to keep their own side happy, to get the votes, to keep them in the position that they're in.
Local councillors were not elected on the same basis as their counterparts in Britain. Over a quarter of the population had no vote in local elections, and most people who owned factories, offices and shops had more than one vote. But this was not the only eccentricity in Northern Ireland local government. Many local authorities like Derry, with Catholic majorities, had unionist councils. The device that ensured control by the minority was known as gerrymandering and involved drawing up the electoral boundaries in such a way as to favour one side. The Waterside ward had 3,500 Protestant voters and 1,800 Catholic. It elected 4 unionist councillors. In the North Ward, 4,000 Protestant votes defeated 2,500 Catholic votes to return 8 unionists. In the South Ward, 10,000 Catholic votes as against 1,100 Protestant votes returned 8 Catholic nationalist councillors. So in all, 12 unionist and 8 nationalist councillors were returned to sit in Derry's Guildhall. The unionists controlled the council. 8,800 Protestant votes returned 12 councillors. 14,500 Catholic votes returned 8 councillors. Derry was not unique. Around the old walled city of Derry, a Catholic vote was, in effect, worth less than half a Protestant vote. Londonderry was a symbol of Protestant fortitude. Behind these walls, the Protestants in 1689 had heroically resisted the siege of the Catholic King James II. But for Catholics, Derry was a symbol of all that was unjust in the Northern Ireland state.
The very stones in Derry oozed discrimination. The city's geographical location symbolized discrimination because Derry was a plantation city. The old walls of the plantation town were still intact. They were still on top of the hill. They looked down upon the vast, sprawling ghetto of the Bogside. And so to the Catholic population of Derry, living in places like the Bogside, they looked up and saw the Protestant city on a hill dominating them in the 1960s as it had done in the 1690s.
If the Unionists were to retain control of the city, it was impossible to rehouse Catholics in the Bogside outside the Catholic ward, since it would upset the delicate electoral balance. The Cameron report said, "Council housing policy has been distorted for political ends in Unionist-controlled areas." The people from these slums in the Bogside had to be rehoused in the Cregan council estate within the ward, but that only consolidated the Catholic ghetto. Derry was the most depressed city in the United Kingdom. Here, in the 60s, unemployment among men was as high as 1 in 5. There was also discrimination at work. An analysis based on the 1961 and 71 censuses found the average Protestant to be a skilled manual worker, the average Catholic an unskilled manual worker. In shipbuilding, 90% of the workforce was Protestant. In engineering, 85%. And the Cameron report found clear evidence of discrimination by local authorities. And those not drawing a wage, the unemployed, were twice as likely to be Catholic.